Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about religious epistemology, but primarily we're going to be talking about um, various terminology within the philosophy of religion. So a lot of this, I'm sure you've heard of at least, but it's good to just kind of go over the basics and get a sense of how to talk and build up a vocabulary for talking confidently about these issues. So first is something like a vocabulary list. These are at least some of the positions that one can hold towards God, say. And they're each going to have different features that distinguish the positions from one another. Um, and then number two, we're going to be talking about ways of holding beliefs on any matters, really. I mean, this is the hard soft distinction that Creel talks about, and then what I'm adding is the friendly unfriendly distinction, are really just useful ways of talking about any sort of view. So let's go on. So think about the Greek pantheon, right? So polytheism is something like the view that there are multiple gods. Given that there are multiple gods, they each do their own thing. They each have their own features. Maybe they're in conflict with one another. Maybe they're in harmony with one another, right? So you think about Greek mythology as a kind of polytheistic viewpoint. Henotheism is, technically speaking, a polytheistic position, but it's the view that among the gods that you have, there is one god that's like the more dominant one. So maybe you could think about Greek mythology in terms of henotheism. If Zeus is the supreme god among the rest of them, right? The rest of the gods are like in some way subordinate to God. And this is an idea that crops up in also in early Judaism. So here are some scriptural passages that are suggestive of a henotheistic position. So, for example, God takes his place among other gods, right? Or God is the first seat and king of the other gods. These are just some. This is something for you to think about, since uh, the early sort of seeds of the rest of Christianity. Is this an accurate way or a plausible way of thinking about God, right? So I think many people would say no, but the scriptures seem to suggest otherwise. So um, let me move this. Okay, so thinking about atheism, agnosticism, deism, and classical theism, it's helpful to look at three claims, what I'm going to call A, B, and C. So A is a summary of the divine attributes, right? So I'm sure many of you have seen these before, right? So omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, right? So that's all powerfulness, all knowing, and all good, right? So these are the features that God has, right? So some views are going to accept these claims, but other divine attributes that you may not have heard of is God is metaphysically simple. God is immaterial, so God doesn't have a physical body, and God is also absolutely immutable in the sense that God does not change in any way, nor does God feel emotion. Metaphysical simplicity is something like the view that God is not multi-parted. So, for example, this is a thing that's multi-parted, right? So I could disassemble this and take all of the parts out of it, right? And then those parts would no longer compose the phone itself. So the idea is something like, if God has parts, then that means that God is, in theory, reducible to more basic elements. And when we think about God, like that doesn't seem to be the right way to think about God, because we want God to be like super perfect. And so if God's like reducible to more basic things, that seems like God is in some way contingent on his parts. And we don't want to say that about God. So God is, consequently, people have argued that God's metaphysically simple. Um, so God is also the creator and sustainer ex nihilo of other things other than God. So the idea here is that God, not only does God create all the stuff, right, like the Genesis story, God also sustains all the stuff through time. And so one way to think about this is that um, we God is intimately keep holding all of the things together at each moment in time, right? So not only does God create everything at a given point in time, rather God perpetually creates throughout time, and that's what we call God sustaining everything. So um, claim B has to do with the relationship between God and either or both moral laws and physical laws, right? And so physical laws being things like 2 + 2 is 4, right? Is God like subject to that? Is that like something that God has to abide by? Like, can God do things that are evil? Um, the claim behind B is that those laws, God's not subject to those laws, nor does God create those laws, but rather that those laws are expressions of God's perfect nature, right? And so it's not necessarily the case that God is like in conflict with these things. Rather, they come from Him, right? And then special divine action is real. This has to do with God's relationship to the world as it is, right? So there are times where God can act in the physical world in ways that go beyond His sustaining the world, right? So in Roman Catholic theology, the Eucharist is literally Christ's body, right? And so, according to that theology, there's a special divine action that occurs when the bread is broken. Is that all of a sudden, all at once, the wafers become God's body, right? And so there's a divine act that occurs during Mass, such that um, that goes beyond God's sustaining and creating. Atheists, right, will obviously reject all three of these claims, right? So it wouldn't make sense to call yourself an atheist if you buy even one of these claims. Agnostics will not accept or reject any of these claims. So the idea with agnosticism is that uh, we just don't have the evidence available to make determinations about any of these claims, right? So it could be that they're true, it could be that they're false, but we just either don't have the evidence yet, or we can't have the evidence to be able to make a determination about any of these claims. Okay, so deists, the view is something like, well, God does exist, but God is independent of human affairs. God doesn't really act in the world, right? So some deists will accept A and B, right? But all deists will definitely, for sure, reject C, right? So that's kind of the deistic making feature, is that you're rejecting miracles, you're rejecting special divine action. Um, and lastly, classical theists will accept all three of these claims. Now, there are some theists that say will reject some of the divine attributes. So those would be a different kind of theism other than classical theism. A classical theist will accept all of the attributes in A and then also B and C. Okay, so we should talk about possible worlds. Okay, so um, this is going to be relevant when we think about the ontological argument. So understanding uh, uh, possible worlds and counterfactuals is going to be really, really important. So you need to listen to what I'm going to say. Okay, so periodically we entertain what are called counterfactual claims, right? We say things like, if I would have gotten to work 5 minutes earlier, then I would have probably found a parking spot, right? Okay, I didn't actually get to work 5 minutes earlier, right? And so I didn't have a parking spot. We do things like this all the time. We say, if I would have married this person over that person, my life would be so much different today. So kind of in the normal way that we talk, we are talking about um, counterfactual claims. Now, in philosophy, we call these counterfactual claims possible worlds. So, a possible world is a state of affairs that could have occurred, right? So, possible worlds stand opposed to what's known as the actual world. So, the actual world is not just like Earth, right? Rather, it's the whole universe and everything in the universe and all of the propositions, either true or false, right? And so, when we entertain other possible worlds, with different propositions are going to be true and false, and different beings are going to exist in those worlds, right? So for example, there is a possible world such that your instructor Spencer Atkins does not exist, right? And that's the only thing that's different between the actual world and that possible world, right? And so philosophers will talk about the nearness and farness of the different possible worlds in terms of the numbers of proposition, or the number of propositions that you need to change in order to make the actual world look like that possible world, right? Um, that's way too detailed. Like we don't need to go there, right? Like possible world distance is like super controversial. Okay, so let's imagine that each of these circles are possible worlds, right? So let's understand P1 as the actual world, right? So this is a possible world that contains a physical universe with a beginning in time, and it has a whole slew of elements that you learn about in chemistry, right? And then it also has more sophisticated beings and entities such as Spencer Atkins, and Tennessee Wesleyan University, right? And then it also has immaterial beings like the angels, such as Michael and Gabriel and Raphael and such. Now, whether or not the actual world does have angels is a subject is a topic of controversy, clearly, and so we will assume that the actual world has these things. Okay, let's say that possible world number two is a world that contains a physical universe, but only has hydrogen atoms, right? So you're not going to get all the fancy, cool stuff like Spencer Atkins or Tennessee Wesleyan University in a world like that, right? But there's still matter that's in that world. And let's suppose that that immaterial angels also exist in that world, and then we can entertain a different possible world um, that where there is no physical universe, and rather there is just immaterial beings such as the angels. And then we can entertain yet another world where there are no angels and there is no physical universe. Right? This is a lot, I know, and this is really weird. Okay, so so why is all of this important? You might be asking yourself. It's important because this kind of thinking about possible worlds opens up one of the divine attributes. So, classical theists will want to make the claim that God is necessarily existent. Okay, so necessary existence stands opposed to contingent existence. Okay, things that exist necessarily exist in all conceivable possible worlds, whereas things that exist contingently, it's possible that they don't exist in possible worlds. There's some possible world such that I don't exist, right? It's possible that I didn't exist. So that means that I'm not a necessarily existent being. So the claim is that God is a necessarily existent being. God exists in all possible worlds, or there is no possible world such that God does not exist. And things like 2 plus 2 equals 4, triangles have 3 sides, those are potentially and arguably necessarily true propositions. So here we'll see a little bit more about contingency and necessity. So these first two are about contingent and necessary truth values, and these last ones are about contingent and necessary beings. So a contingently true proposition is true, say, in some possible worlds, but is, say, not true in all possible worlds. Propositions like Spencer exists, Socrates is a man, right? That might be a contingent truth, right? And then propositions that are necessarily true are true in every possible world. So triangles have 3 sides, 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? Mathematical truths, things like this. Various first principles, perhaps in physics. And then a being that exists contingently, for example, your instructor, Spencer Atkins, will exist in some possible worlds, but not all of them. And then that stands opposed to a necessarily existent being, which is a being, not a proposition, a being that exists in every possible world. The claim um, that the theist wants to make is that God exists in all possible worlds. God is necessarily existent. Okay, so we're going to see um, in the ontological argument, we're going to be borrowing from some of these concepts. And that's kind of why I'm spending a lot of time talking about this, is that the ontological argument is going to say, look, there's a possible world such that there's a being that exists necessarily, right? You know, that's not impossible. If there's at least one possible world with a necessarily existent being, that means that that being exists in all possible worlds. The actual world is a possible world. Oh, look, that means that God exists in the actual world, right? So it's kind of this like, if you accept this, we derive that God actually exists, right? So that's going to be important for just like uh, potentially today's class, today's other class. So lastly, we should distinguish between hard and soft and friendly and unfriendly beliefs, right? So you can have you can hold your position in a number of different ways. So suppose that you believe in God. You can be a soft theist or a hard theist. Creel talks about this, and he says that the difference between the hard and soft distinction is a matter between proof and probability, right? So a hard theist is going to say the evidence that I have that suggests that God exists proves that God exists, such that there is no good evidence for me to entertain that suggests that God does not exist. Whereas the soft theist is going to say the evidence that I hold that shows that God exists um, is makes it probable that God exists, but new evidence might make it less probable, right? So the idea is that what stance do you take for your view, and like what's the epistemic status of the view? Do you have proof for your view, or do you have like a probability for your view. And you could just say this with like whether or not abortion is okay, about any number of different claims, whether you're like a Democrat or like a Republican, maybe you're like a hard Democrat, or like a soft Republican or whatever. And so, okay, so there's another distinction between friendly and unfriendly that is also relevant here. So a friendly, let's just say go with a theist. A friendly theist is going to say something like, look, there are good arguments for, say, atheism or for some non-theistic positions, right? So there are atheists out there, and they are totally reasonable to hold their views. Whereas an unfriendly theist is going to say something like, look, there are no good arguments for the opposite position, right? So there are no good arguments that show that God does not exist, right? And so everybody that holds that view is being irrational, right? And so you can be, and this is a cross-cutting distinction, so you can be a hard, unfriendly atheist. You can be a soft, unfriendly communist. You can be, and so you can mix and match all of these different terms together, right? And get a new view, right? So you can say that, look, the evidence that I have definitively proves that God exists, right? I would be a hard theist if I thought that. And it's the case, but it's also the case that there are good arguments for, say, atheism, right? In which case I would be a hard, friendly theist. So anyway, so this is two really, really, really helpful distinctions that will help us get more precise about how we hold different views, right? And how we engage with people who think differently than we do. So anyway, get your discussion post in, um, and get on the ontological argument. All right, take care. Bye-bye.